Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. And if you would, please open a Bible to Esther 3. And we'll have to backtrack a little into chapter 2 territory to cover the stuff on Mordecai that we didn't get to last week, but we'll get into that. What I want to do this morning is actually kind of get all cinematic this week to think about our reading, like we have to make a film of our chapter, like an episode of The Chosen or something like that. And being a former marketer, I think about the fact that a good episode of a good show is going to need a good trailer, right, to get people to want to watch it. And the trailer I would envision for this chapter actually comes from the final moments of our reading. You see, up to this point in our story, things have been rather, relatively pleasant, right? Last week in Esther, we got a glimpse of our heroine, Esther herself, and there we saw that she's a picture of, an image of the orphaned, exiled daughter of Zion, right? A figure of Israel herself at this moment. Right? And the story makes clear that even in this exiled state, she's beautiful. Beautiful in the eyes of all who see her. Beautiful in the eyes of the king. Literally in the eyes of the king of Persia, but figuratively, her Lord God, the king of all kings. Beautiful even in her exile. Beautiful in her suffering and humiliation. Both exiled, orphan, and by the end of the chapter, queen over all by the end of chapter 2. And the week before that, we were introduced to the frat house that is the Persian court, right? A world of absurdity, absurd in terms of its power, in terms of its wealth, in terms of its partying, in terms of its insecurity, in terms of its overreactions to thinking anything that threatens it. But this week, things get dark, right? And the trailer that I would air to rope people in this week is the scene at the end, the second half of the very last verse, verse 15. And the king and Haman sat down to drink or to feast. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion, or better, was dumbfounded. In other words, we're back once again in the world of the absurd feasting of the Persian court from chapter 1. But here, the feasting now takes place in the dark shadow of a genocidal decree to kill all the Jews in the Persian Empire, historically probably in the hundreds of thousands. It's a picture of what the Jewish anarchist, philosopher, and journalist Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. The banality of evil. She coined that expression covering the trial of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann in Israel, this traveling salesman who becomes an SS bureaucrat and who simply, efficiently, administratively oversaw basically the same thing that Haman is planning, the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews. And her point, Arendt's point, was the image that's captured here is evil at its most indifferent, evil at its most banal. And that terrible, indifferent, banal character of evil in this response of drinking and feasting is made to stand out even further in the response of the city, in the response of all the normal people, which is one of shock. And our trailer obviously would somehow capture all this, such that when our viewers tune in, the question would be, well, how did they get here? How did they get to this point? Well, how did we? And to answer that, to get into our episode proper, right, keeping with our whole cinematic theme a little while longer, to get into our episode proper, it's actually helpful to begin to start our episode, not with the beginning of the chapter, but actually much further back, right? To start with a flashback. Actually, to start with 3 flashbacks, right? Because we're going to overdo it today, right? 3 inscriptured moments in Israel's past that will help us set the context for this contest that's taking place in our story. So, flashback number 1. Imagine across the bottom of the screen, it says Exodus 17. The wilderness of Sinai, 1,000 years ago, right? That's 1,000 years before our story, Esther 3. And we open on a battle between the Israelites and this nomadic tribe that we know is descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob, a tribe known as the Amalekites. And the Israelites are just days out of escaping Egypt and slavery when this group, out of nowhere, just attacks them in the wilderness. But for our heroes, right, as long as Moses keeps his arms raised up, Joshua and his army will prevail. And by sundown, Moses has some mighty sore arms, but the Amalekites are defeated, right? And then we fade out, right? Flashback number one. Flashback number two, we fade in again. We get a new title across the bottom of the screen. Numbers 24, overlooking the plains of Moab, 40 years later, 900 or so years before our story. And now we pan on this guy, and he's out on a hilltop overlooking these plains of Jordan, overlooking the Jordan River, the plains of Moab, overlooking the Jordan River. And out there are encamped countless Israelites. And we get some exposition somehow. I don't know. I haven't written the script yet for it, right? And this guy is Balaam. And we know that he's been paid to curse all those Israelites out there. But somehow, because of God, he just can't. And maybe we get something like a montage at this point. It's a South Park, but you've got to have a montage sometimes, right? And we get a montage of all these failed attempts, right? Like Rocky training for the big fight or something, but it's different. And eventually, finally, we hear Balaam say a couple curious things pertinent to our episode for this week. He says, Israel's king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted, right? And then, a little bit later, Amalek was first among the nations, right? That is to attack Israel. But its end is utter destruction. And then we fade out again. Fade in one more time, flashback 3. Another title screen. 1 Samuel 15, city of Amalek, southern Judah. 600 years later, 500 years before our story, right? We're getting close to Esther 3. We're almost there. And we close in on King Saul, the first king of Israel, with over 200,000 men defeating the Amalekites once again and killing them all, just as commanded by the Lord. Just as that Balaam guy back in our previous flashback had predicted. Saul kills them all, except for the king, except for King Agag of Amalek. Saul spares his life. Why? I don't know. Maybe he wants to show him off as a prisoner or something. Don't know. Doesn't matter. The point is, Saul disobeys the Lord. And the very next thing that happens is the Lord declares, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. Right? And then because I'm the director of this thing and I want a Star Wars tie-in, and I want a chance to meet Ewan McGregor, I get Obi-Wan Kenobi to appear at this moment and say, Saul, you were the chosen one. You were supposed to destroy the Amalekites, not let their king Agag live. Haven't you read the story in Exodus 17? Haven't you read the prophecy in Numbers 24? Right? And then he'll say something about the high ground or something like that. Right? And then we fade out and we fade into our story proper at this point. New title across the bottom of the screen, Esther 3. 500 years later, present-day Susa in the Persian Empire. And we pan in on the sinister face of our arch-villain Haman, right? Cue theme music, ominous theme music at this point. So let's now look at verse 1 of chapter 3 to see what we're supposed to see in this character. Verse 1, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Okay, first, after these things, it tells us time has passed since the events of the previous chapter. And if we do the math, which we're not going to do here, but you can trust me, it turns out it's 6 years later. So it's the 12th year of the king's reign. But the critical thing to note here is how Haman is identified here as the Agagite. The Agagite. In other words, Haman is a descendant of that Agag, the Amalekite king whom we saw in our last flashback, right? The one Saul lets live. It's as if history, Israel's disobedient history in the land, is coming back to bite Israel in the butt in this moment. Because here in Haman is Israel's first foe, the Amalekites, the very first people to attack Israel, as we saw in our first flashback, attacking them out of nowhere in the wilderness of Sinai, outside the land, just as they are right now in Persia. Right? And this is an ancient hatred. Amalek, the father of the Amalekites, he's the grandson of Esau, Jacob's older brother, who conned Esau out of his birthright. In other words, this goes deep, right? But there's even more to what's going on here, because if we go back to how Mordecai is introduced back in chapter 2, and you got to go back to verse 5 there, this is what we find. Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shammai, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Now, leaving Jair aside, because nobody knows what to do with that. I mean, if you can figure it out, heck, there's probably a PhD there. But regardless, right? I bet solid money that it fits in with the logic of what the other three markers are doing in terms of how we're meant to understand who Mordecai is. And specifically, the other three, Shimei, Kish, and being a Benjaminite, are clearly aimed at associating Mordecai in a vague but definite way with King Saul. Saul was a Benjaminite. Kish is the name of Saul's father. And Shimei, in 2 Samuel 16, after Saul is dead, long dead, some guy named Shimei shows up in the middle of Absalom's rebellion against King David, his father. This guy, Shimei, shows up to throw stones at David and to shout, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. In other words, Shimei here references a staunch supporter of Saul from 2 Samuel, one who is for Saul even after Saul is dead. And all these things add up to paint a Saul-like picture of Mordecai. Still, the author wants to keep a slight distance here, because the author could have identified Mordecai directly as a son of Saul, as a descendant of Saul, which he doesn't do. In other words, he lets you see the Saul connection, but then pulls it back before you can make too much of this thing. Before you're tempted to reduce whatever's going on in our story into some kind of, rematch, right? Like the Book of Esther is, Saul versus Agag, round 2. This time it's no mercy, no mas, right? Let's get ready to rumble, right? That's not the point. Rather, what's in view, I think, is a grammar of hatred against God's people, and therefore against God himself, and what it means to be faithful in such a place. See, chapter 2 showed us one reaction of the world to God's people, right? And the beauty of God's people, even orphaned and exiled like Esther is. A beauty that draws people in. But chapter 3 shows us the other reaction, the world's rejection of the beloved of God, rooted in the world's rejection of God. So when the Amalekites first attack Israel in the wilderness of Exodus 17, this is the language. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel. That's it. There's no reason. There's no provocation. There's no instigating factor. It's just, then these guys attacked. And Jesus, of course, is kind of the epitome of this tension of God's people, this tension that demands a choice. As Simeon says, he is a sign that is opposed, right? Or as Jesus himself says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. A sorting out of where the world stands in response to God. In this case, in Haman, it's a picture of rejection. It's a picture of hatred. And thus, in the person of Mordecai, who is connected to Saul, there is also in view the question of how God's people will respond this time in this fight, literally to the death. Will they respond faithfully, obediently, trusting in the Lord, or not? So now that we got our two heavyweights in the ring, let's see how round 1 of our bout, not that it's supposed to be that, plays out. Verse 1. We get this kind of grandiose triple elevation of Haman. The king, it says, promotes Haman, he advances him, and he sets his throne above all the other officials, right? It's this triple sort of beat that's sort of like everything else in the book is sort of a little bit more absurdly elevated, right? And also, very much like the rest of the book, no reason is given, right? No reason is given for his promotion. In fact, given what happened at the end of chapter 2, the fact that Mordecai prevented an assassination attempt on the king, given that, one would think that Mordecai should get the promotion. But no, if you look at the end of Esther 2, verse 23, Mordecai only kind of gets like a little short attaboy in the official record. It's kind of like I saved the king's life and all I got was this lousy t-shirt kind of moment, right? Anyway, no reason is given for that either. But we are told that everyone, verse 2, is commanded to bow down to Haman. And then comes the trigger moment for Mordecai, for Haman, for our whole plot. Still in verse 2, but Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Again, no reason is given. Now, sometimes Mordecai's refusal is read on the order of when Daniel and his friends refused to worship the golden image that their king has set up. But that's not what's being asked here. There are plenty of examples throughout the Old Testament of faithful Israelites bowing in respect to other human beings, right? Abraham bows to the Hittites of all people at one point, and he prays that the nations would bow to Isaac. Even the prophet Nathan bows to David in 1 Kings 1. It's just a sign of respect. It's a salute, right? So that's not the point. Ultimately, what's going on is like with Vashti's refusal to obey the king back in chapter 1. And that refusal, in a way, is kind of a preview, a foreshadowing of what's going on in our chapter, right? And as with her, we can only speculate, right? So with Mordecai, we can only speculate about the nature of his refusal. However, logically, given who these two characters are, the reason seems likely tied to this long-standing biblical ethnic tension between Israel and Amalek, between Saul and Agag, right? That Mordecai and Haman are being set up to represent. In other words, Mordecai, as Israel, cannot bow to Israel's ancient enemy. He cannot bow to the ancient hatred that Haman represents in the bigger picture of inscription history. And this sets everything in motion. To start, the Persian court does what it does best, right? They freak out, right? Halfway through verse 3, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Now, that language is actually really reminiscent of the Joseph story from Genesis, right? It's the moment where Potiphar's wife is trying to tempt Joseph into various, stuff, shall we say. Here's the language from Genesis, and you can see the echoes or hear the echoes. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her. Right? Very similar. Too similar to be an accident. Right? So, in other words, that context of the Joseph story, which is a story about a Jew living in the nations, serving as an important role in the court, right? In the context of that Joseph story, the temptation of an Israelite out in the world to submit to what is wrong, right? It's being subtly laid over our story. It's like, if you're watching a show and you hear those two famous notes, dun, dun, right? You know what that is. You know instantly, theme from Jaws, there's a lurking danger somewhere. It's kind of like that, right? Here, even if you're not sure why, you're being told, right, because of those Joseph overtones, that bowing to Haman, bad idea. It's a temptation to which Mordecai can't yield. Anyway, Mordecai remains steadfast in his refusal. And Haman's response, like the king in court to Vashti in chapter 1, his response, verse 5, is to be filled with fury. And, as they do, to overreact by deciding to kill all of Mordecai's people, an entire ethnicity for this individual's refusal to bow. Verse 6. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought it to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In a sense, there's some logic going on here. If Mordecai is refusing to bow to Haman because he's an Amalekite, right? Haman draws a logical implication, namely that no Jew will bow, and so all must die, right? Josephus, the ancient Roman Jewish historian, actually thought it made a lot of sense. Saul had killed all of the Amalekites, except for King Agag. And now Agag's descendant, Haman, is taking vengeance for his own people. So how does Haman respond? Well, first, before he does anything, weirdly, he casts lots, right, to figure out apparently the most auspicious day to order the genocide of all the Jews in the Persian Empire. And the point is to see here where Haman's faith and trust lies. In other words, as he prepares to carry out this scheme, which is equal parts brutal and absurd, where is his confidence? Where does it reside? Well, it turns out his confidence resides in some very strange, elaborate divination procedure that is as absurd as everything else in the story, right? Because this ridiculous ritual basically involves an entire year of Yahtzee, right? An entire year of rolling the dice to figure out when's the best day to kill a few 100,000 people. It's a tad crazy, right? But honestly, I kind of get it. Whenever I'm feeling a little overweight and I want to do something about it, I spend a year on YouTube researching the best diets and exercise programs, right? So, apart from this whole genocide thing, I guess Haman and I aren't so different after all. Anyway, it's also odd that Haman focuses on such details, right? He's got to cast lots to find that perfect day, when he hasn't even gone to the king yet with his brilliant idea. You think he'd ask the king first before you start, working out the nuts and bolts, start with your 10% design before you go to full design, that kind of thing. But then again, given this king, maybe it doesn't really matter, right? Because when he does go to the king, he gives the king 3 reasons. Verse 8, right? 3 reasons for why killing all the Jews is a reasonable, beneficial course of action. And they're all partially true, but they're all also kind of hardly reasons for genocide, right? Reason one, they're scattered and dispersed. True, but that hardly seems ground for mass murder. The Persian Empire is actually filled with scattered people because, as it turns out, scattering people is second to impaling people for the Persians' predecessors, the Assyrians and Babylonians. If you didn't impale them, you probably scattered and dispersed them. Reason two that Haman gives, they have different customs. The ESV uses laws. That's not really the best translation there. But his point is, they're different from other people. Kind of yeah, kind of no. Not necessarily more so than any other ethnic community. Reason three, and this is kind of the weird one, they don't obey imperial law. Okay, well, you could say Haman is, with his whole, Mordecai with his not bowing thing is an example of this. But the only real solid Persian law in the Persian Empire was pay your taxes. Right? And that doesn't seem to be a problem, given that Haman offers at the end of all this to make up for all those lost taxes, and in a way that he thinks will seal the deal. Right? Because in verse 9, what does he offer the king? 10,000 talents of silver to cover lost revenue, right? That he probably just implied the Jews weren't paying anyway. Now, 10,000 talents of silver is, to put it in perspective, 333 tons of silver, right? You think about where you put that in your backyard, right? It's a ridiculously huge sum of money. In today's terms, that is a little over $250 million, right? Historically speaking, that is more than the annual GDP of the entire Persian Empire. So again, even as we're talking about genocide here, everything is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous plan worked out via a ridiculous ritual, explained to the king with ridiculous reasons, backed up by an absolutely ridiculous bribe. And all to a king who, ridiculously, doesn't take the bribe. Right? Verse 10, so the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. Note, the narrator at this moment, just like in last chapter, he told you Esther's name and her lineage right before the big event. Again, at this key moment of Haman, he underscores who Haman is for you, that he is both an Agagite and one who hates the Jews. But, continuing, and the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also to do with them as it seems good to you. In other words, yo, my man Haman, what's $276 million between friends, right? You go for it. You make your dreams happen, right? But on a number of fronts, the reaction of the king is actually not that surprising, right? In terms of generosity, the king has been crazy generous in the story, really crazy generous. Not $276 million crazy generous, but still. He has a party for everyone in chapter 1. He remits everybody's taxes in chapter 2 to celebrate the elevation of Esther to be queen. But also in terms of agreeability, this guy is, so far in our story, a guy who seems to have a really hard time saying no, right? All you got to do is get in there with your request and it'll be okay, basically, right? The queen makes us nervous. Can you divorce her? Okay, right? Can we lock up all the young women in the empire for you? Okay, right? Can I kill all the Jews sometime next year? Okay, right? And at this moment, we're back to where we began, right? Back to that trailer we imagined for Esther episode 3. The ridiculous banality of the evil that's in view here. Haman might be foaming at the mouth with his hatred, with his version of evil, but the king, in his absent-minded agreement to murder hundreds of thousands of men and women and children, man, if you thought the emperor had no clothes at the end of chapter 1, right, with all the absurdity there, here it's the absurdity of naked and different and human evil, right, of that same world, right, which is made brutally clear in this moment. And this is the darkest moment of the book. Haman is at the height of his power. The Jews in Persia are slated for destruction in less than a year's time by an irrevocable decree of a Persian king. And nothing looks good in this moment. It is a moment seemingly without any hope. So what do we do with all this? Right? Great story, bit of a downer, but where the heck is the gospel in this? Short of jumping to the end of the book and reassuring ourselves that all is going to be well that ends well, that kind of thing, where's the good news at this point in our story when we're up to our eyeballs in hatred and revenge and the indifference towards those things, right? And the indifference of the one person who can actually make a difference here, right? It's a terrible moment where everything looks hopeless for our heroes. So where's the good news here? right? And it's actually an incredibly relevant question just in general, because most of the time when things look bad in your life, they typically just look bad, right? That's, in our own lives, just like here. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I'm stressed out about something, I got nothing but tunnel vision, right? It's like the only three characters in my story in those moments are me, my problem, and my raging anxiety. So where is God to be found in such moments, whether in the story or whether in your life? Because he's definitely there, right? He's there for me just outside that narrow little tunnel that my stress has reduced my world to. And he's definitely here in our story, even as he seems absent, even as he seems nowhere to be found. But where do you find God? Well, here in our story, it's in his word. It's in the reality that while there are certainly corners of this fallen world groaning for redemption that find God's people to be something desirable and beautiful, there's also so much of it that hates what God is doing through them, what God is doing through his people, through his church, sometimes even through us, who knows? In other words, you're not always paranoid. Sometimes the world really is out to get you. But in that place, you got to go back to those flashbacks with which we began, particularly that second one. I mean, the Amalekites, they aren't really mentioned a whole heck of a lot in Scripture, right? There's that surprise attack in Exodus, right, from flashback 1. There is, I didn't mention it, a commandment in Deuteronomy that instructs them to blot the Amalekites out completely. There's Saul's almost, but not quite following through on that commandment to blot them all out, killing everybody but their king. And then, of course, we have Haman here, who's an Amalekite in our story. But there's also that flashback number 2, God's unstoppable blessing over Israel through the unwilling Balaam, who's trying to do anything but. A blessing that promises Israel's triumph over the Amalekites. And so our story may be about Haman's hatred and plot for revenge, and things looking utterly hopeless for Mordecai and God's people. But all of that is set in the bigger sovereign picture of God's blessing over his people. And that's true of you and me too. The world does indeed sometimes look bleak. Our lives sometimes involve terrible things that we have to live through. And our choices and our decisions in and through all such moments, they do matter and they do have consequences. But at the end of the day, God is sovereign. And his love and his care for his people and his good plans for them, they are unstoppable. And the things arrayed against us can't stop those plans. And our own failings and our shortcomings can't stop those plans. And that word for us, written over all history, written over all our lives, that word for us is the word writ out in the large letters in the blood of Jesus Christ shed for us on his cross. And it's his blood and his cross that stands over and above all the tragedies and would-be tragedies of history in our lives. Because the true battle was never between Israel and the Amalekites, or Saul and Agag, or Mordecai and Haman. It was between Jesus and our sin. It was between Jesus and our cold, dark hearts. It was between Jesus and our adversary, the devil, Jesus and our just sentence of death. And Jesus is the victor in all those things, not just in promise, but in accomplished fact. And so to him be all the glory forever and ever. Amen.